चेक करना. Hi guys, I hope everybody is able to see me, hear me, and see the screen properly. Can I get a quick confirmation on chat, please, from people? Can I get quick confirmation on chat from people? What about others? Can I get a quick confirmation if you can see me, hear me, and see the screen properly? Yes, perfect. So, thank you very much, guys, for joining in. The purpose of this session is basically to guide students who are appearing for FRM Level 1 in the November 2022 exam. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through each book, okay, and each chapter. I'm just going to keep on highlighting what I feel is going to be important or the student should focus on for each book. So before we start the session, please make sure that you have the four books, the four Swedger books primarily available with you. I'll be walking you through the Swedger books which I see on the screen. Okay, so I hope everybody is ready with this, and we're going to be, please make sure that you have the books open with you and a pencil or a pen to mark the section. Okay, wherever it is important, I'll keep on highlighting the part or the learning objective as important. Okay, so are we ready? Is everybody ready for the session? Please put it on the comment section. Okay, so let us start with the first book, which is the Foundation of Risk Management. The total weightage of the book is around 20%. So we expect around 20 question from the book. Okay, around 20 questions. So if you look at the chapter, I'm just going to move towards the individual chapters just to give you an overview in the sense which chapter should you focus more on during the exam time. I've already created a separate video for the same, but just to give you a heads up. So these three chapters are purely theoretical chapter. You can expect an interlinked question in the first three chapters of the book. Credit transfer and credit mechanism. Okay, this chapter ideally you should be reading with Anatomy of Great Financial Crisis. There is a chapter one more which is there. In these two chapters can be combined and can be asked question from the exam perspective. The modern portfolio theory is important. This is also a base chapter for your level 2. From the pharma French, there is sorry, from the APT arbitrage pricing theory, there is a pharma French theory which is important. Principle of effective is data aggregation, not very important. I don't see much questions coming. One or two students might get a question from this chapter, but not the overall population who's going for the exam. Okay, so that is the idea. Enterprise risk management, you can expect one theory question from this chapter also somewhere. So connecting to the broader aspect of risk management, they can test you. Learning from financial disaster is an important chapter, very important chapter. I'll be highlighting few case studies on this chapter as we go towards the book. Okay, Anatomy of Great Financial Crisis is again an important chapter. Okay, this chapter, the credit risk transfer mechanism, and there's one more chapter in book 3, which is mortgage and mortgage-backed security. You should be reading the book, these three chapters together. Okay, it's a very important chapter. Next, GARP Code of Conduct, very important chapter. But when you read the textbook, you might not get a fair idea about it. More and more question solving is needed for this chapter. So I'm just going through each chapter now, trying to highlight what is the important concept or which part can be important from the exam perspective. So when you go to the first chapter, which is the building blocks of risk management, when you come to this risk management process, you should focus on the risk management process, okay, which you can get some theory related concept over here. Then there is a concept of known and unknown risk. I don't expect a case study kind of question. I don't expect that. I don't expect a very basic theory question to come from this part. This diagram is also important. You should remember from that perspective. Okay. Moving forward, this paragraph, there is the concept of retaining, transfer, or mitigate. You can get some question with respect to some case study or asking you to take a decision. Okay, with which step will you use? Or they will give you a case study explaining you what the manager has already done, and they might ask you whether he has avoided the risk, whether you have taken, mitigated the risk, transferred the risk. That way, the questions can come. Okay, as we move ahead, measuring and monitoring a risk, the basic concept of what is VAR. Okay, don't worry, this is there over here, but again, it will come in your book 4, which is Valuation and Risk Model. So just highlighting it because overall VAR as a concept is important for your FRM level 1 exam. As we move ahead, moving towards the quantitative risk part, quantitative risk assessment, over here, scenario analysis, you can expect some theory question related to overall scenario analysis and stress testing, but more or less scenario analysis is what I expect. So this, and there is one more chapter in your book 4 focusing on stress testing. You can expect the concept being tested. Moving ahead, enterprise risk management. Over here, this part is not important because there is one more chapter explicitly focusing on enterprise risk management. Expected loss. Okay, this entire concept with the formula is important for your reading perspective from the exam. So do not skip this part. This part is again there in measuring credit risk in your book 4, valuation and risk model. Okay, so please make sure that you are good with that concept. Okay, for moving further, we move towards the risk and reward, more or less theory. I don't expect explicit question to come over here. Not so very important from the exam perspective. I'm just moving ahead. Okay, and you can read this part as a reference point, not very important. Just read that 3 pointer and we can move ahead. With respect to types of risk, you can focus on the interest rate risk to a certain extent, okay, the equity risk to a certain extent, because the diversification and the general market risk, it is getting repeated in a lot of chapters. Okay, rest you can directly go to the credit risk part. Within the credit risk, settlement risk is important. It can get tested in your exam, so please make sure that you highlight those pointers or you are okay with that concept. And moving ahead, uh, liquidity risk, both of them are important. Okay, so marking this part for the chapter, important in the sense when you read this chapter, you should focus on these things properly. Okay, operation risk, not so important. There is one more chapter in book 4. We will be talking about operation risk more in detail. Then, to a certain extent, you can also focus on reputation risk that can get tested in the exam. With this, we're going to be moving towards the risk factor interaction. Over here, you can talk about the this second paragraph, slightly interesting paragraph, okay, with respect to the content connected to the risk metrics like VAR, expected shortfall, and all of that. Next, RAROC part, the risk adjusted return on capital, you can expect this part or this concept, okay, being tested in some theory or some concept or some question. Okay, so I'm just trying to make sure that throughout the entire chapter, I'm just highlighting which I feel as a part you should focus on when you're revising or reading the content. Moving toward the second chapter. Perfect. Moving toward the second chapter. I hope everybody is marking in their book. The second chapter, how do firm manage their financial risk? Okay, you can see that this part, accept, avoid, mitigate, is again getting repeated. So it is connected to the first chapter also. A lot of theoretical content over here. Now this part, from here till here, this is just an example of those 4 steps. So you can read, but if you want to skip it, if you're confident on the concept, then you can skip it. There is no problem over here. Next, moving towards the risk identification and risk appetite part, I think so you should focus on this paragraph while reading the chapter or while revising the chapter. As we move ahead, the diagram is not important. The role of board of directors, okay, this paragraph is important from the exam perspective. Focus on that when you revise and read. Moving ahead, uh, there are few pointers over here. This one, the possibility of risk tolerance and unity of risk appetite. So just read these pointers properly. Risk mapping, more or less, not very. I don't think so. This is very important. So you can skip this part. Hedging risk exposure, hedging in practice, I think so. You can focus more on because I've heard that people have got questions related to these concepts in the past exams, not the immediate exam, but in the past exam. They have been asked questions related to this. Okay, theoretical part is not a very important section. The disadvantage of hedging, this paragraph, the practical disadvantage, you can focus from the exam perspective, reading perspective. Challenges involved in hedging strategy, the metal gazelle shaft, and this part you should definitely read. And but when you read that case study in your learning from financial disaster, this becomes easy. Okay. With this, we are going to move towards the second part of the chapter: pricing risk, foreign currency risk. Okay, and there's one more: interest rate risk. Okay, so over here, the foreign currency risk is what you can focus on from this module. Most of the time, if they are going to test you, they might test you asking the core part of this entire module using foreign currency as a reference point. Okay, then we can move towards the impact of risk management tool. Now, over here, they have given you the entire table. Okay, what banks can use to reduce their risk. Okay, so notional limit is widely tested in level 2 also. I see that they ask questions related to notional limit. Okay, maturity gap and VAR and stress testing. So you can read these 4 pointers properly for your exam and for your reference. Okay, next, these part are just there's nothing to worry about these products, because as you complete book 3, you'll become very clear on these products, so don't worry over here as such. You can move basis risk. Okay, wherever you see basis risk, you should definitely focus on that. You can get a theory question explicitly talking about basis risk. Okay, so please make sure that you are good on that content. Next, I'm going to move towards the third chapter, which is the governance of risk management. Previously, this chapter was very small. Now it has increased in the size. They have increased it because of the corporate governance logic implemented heavily in the banks. Okay, so the starting part, it's more or less theoretical. When we move towards the regulation aspect of it, they have listed some key lessons which the banks have learned. So those key lessons, I feel you should focus on while reading this part. You should read the entire chapter, but I'm just highlighting which concepts are important. People who are joining late, I'm just reiterating that point. Okay, so these lessons definitely you should focus on. Basel 1, 2, 3, not so important. Liquidity coverage ratio logic and net stable funding coverage ratio important from the exam perspective. These numbers, I don't think so they can get tested in the exam because they are connected to more or less level 2. So they might test level 2 students on that, not level 1. Okay, they have explicit chapters on Basel related risk. Let us move towards the next part. The guidelines for banking sector with respect to the BCBS part. Now over here, the governance of the conglomerate is important. Okay, I've heard in some of the white papers they're talking about it. Next is the compensation. There's one more point, board composition. So you can focus on these pointers at an overall level. Okay. FRTB, not to worry, there is it's more or less related to level 2. I don't expect level 1 students will be asked questions related to that. Okay. Dodd-Frank Act also gave some key elements. So in that, the resolution and ending too big to fail logic is very important. Volcker rule, which is prohibiting your proprietary trading, was implemented in the industry, can be important from the reading perspective. As we move ahead, the governance of the risk management best practices section, uh, clawback provision is important. Okay, we have seen a lot of banks now implementing this for their senior management role. Next, this MF Global case study, marking it as star. Read this case study properly. MF Global case study. Okay. Then, with respect to risk management section, not so important. Moving towards the third module, the roles of the risk advisory director. Okay, this is easy, but you can expect a question in the exam. Okay, so definitely you should focus on this. Next, as we move ahead, compensation committee is okay. Risk appetite and business strategy. Okay. Now, in this part, I think so. The first two paragraph you should focus on while reading the content. Next, as we move ahead, more or less similar. This part you guys can focus for understanding the concept much better. Might get tested in this section. Interdependency of functional unit. I don't expect any specific question to be asked right now, at least. Audit committee's responsibility. You can focus. Okay, chances that they might ask a question related to this. Also, what is the role of audit committee and how they can reduce the risk when they are doing their activity or duties. So with this, we are moving towards the fourth question. With this, we are moving towards the fourth chapter, which is related to credit risk transfer mechanism. Okay, like I said, this chapter has to be read along with the other two chapters. One is in book one and one is in book three. As we move ahead, CDS as a concept should be very, very clear to you how it works. Okay, what are the advantages and disadvantages? Very important from the exam perspective. I mean, reading perspective, if you look at this chapter, they can test you over here, the CDS part. Okay, all the advantage, all the disadvantages. CDO and MBO not very likely tested. Okay, the tranches part, it is again there in Anatomy of Great Financial Crisis and MBS, so definitely a good chance that they might test you over there, not here. Next is reducing credit risk exposure. Now, historical mechanism of maintaining credit risk. Okay, especially this exposure and mark to market part is very, very important, and the collateral part is very important. Now, wrong way risk is there as a reference point over here. In level 2, they test more on wrong way risk, not in level 1. Okay, so these things are good. Syndication is also important. Within syndication, you can have best effort and firm commitment. So when you're reading, please make sure that you read the entire content or entire paragraph properly for the exam. Credit derivative part, more or less, not so important. I don't feel it might get tested. Okay, this part, the section 15G, please make sure that you are aware about it for the exam perspective. Securitization and SPV, more or less, if you know the basic concepts of mortgage-backed security, the same thing is again repeated. Okay, please make sure that you're good with the disadvantage of the OTD model, originate to distribute model. Rest everything is good. Let us move towards the next chapter, which is your modern portfolio theory and capital asset pricing model. Let us move towards that. When we talk about that chapter, the basic assumptions of Markovich theory. Okay, you can get questions telling you that which of the assumption is there in Markovich and not in CAPM. So you can get some question like that. Okay, so concept of the assumption should be clear. Then as we move ahead, uh, the idea, one second, there is this concept of diversification. Okay, when basic, this can be important from the exam perspective. You can get tested over here. Efficient frontier logic is important. Why we are choosing E and not A. That part is important. There is one paragraph as we move ahead. There are two lines which you should focus on. Okay, actually, the main crux is over here in these three, four lines. So, if you read these three, four lines, then everything is done for that paragraph, for that diagram. Capital market line, okay, this part where they're saying this entire part, this is important. Okay, where they're saying that when you add a risk-free asset, what happens? Okay, the formula is not tested as such, but the base of the formula, which is this, the Sharpe measure, is connected to one of the previous next chapters. That's why I have highlighted it for the exam perspective. Okay, let us move towards the CAPM. Derivation of CAPM is not important. They don't test you on derivation, they test you more on the assumption and the implementation of the model or implementation of that formula. Okay, so from the exam perspective, you should be clear on that. The assumption should be clear. Beta formula not heavily tested as of now. I've not heard beta formula being tested, but the logic of beta, how exactly this beta is calculated using regression, you should be clear on that part. Next, deriving CAPM not important. This diagram can get tested. Okay, when the security is above, security is below, what is it overvalued, undervalued? That logic you guys should be clear with. Okay, the example is important from the exam perspective, and these two pointers, these two paragraphs, which actually summarizes the entire CAPM, is important from the exam perspective. Okay, let us move forward. There are portfolio performance evaluation measures, which is Sharp Trainer and Jensen's Alpha. We call it as Alpha, or it is written as Jensen's measure. Okay, from this, generally you expect Sharp and Trainer to be connected and asked as a question. Okay, so marking both of them as important. You should know when to use Sharp, when to use Trainer. Okay, what is the core part of the SHAR, which is the core the sigma, and over here beta. So those kind of theoretical questions you can expect rather than calculation based questions. Okay, because calculation based questions are going to be very easy. So read both sharp and trainer from the concept perspective. Jensen's alpha, not so important. uh, Tracking error as a concept is important. Okay, not the calculation, they don't ask you the calculation part, only the understanding part, what exactly is tracking error telling you. Okay, and information ratio, this part, the active return divided by active risk, that is important. Short Sortino I've not heard being tested heavily, so definitely you guys can read it, but not so heavy from the exam perspective. We are moving towards the next chapter, which is the arbitrage pricing theory. Okay, arbitrage pricing theory, which is the multi-factor model aspect. Now over here, pharma French, which is going to come further. This is very important. From the exam perspective, the assumptions of the arbitrage theory, you should know about it. Then what exactly is, how exactly the multi-factor model works? This, the parts of it, you should be clear. What is F? What is beta? What is expected return? What are we doing with this model? That you should be clear with. Okay, they can ask you theoretical based question more over here. Next is more or less, this is an example. I don't expect any specific question to be coming over here. The accounting for correlation part can get tested, marking it as star. So please make sure that you read the concepts properly. Hedging part, not seen, not heard, heavily tested from the APT perspective. Pharma French double star, very, very important. I expect questions, most of the students getting questions from this. So please make sure that you should be clear what is there in each part of Pharma French. That means small minus, big, H minus, L, all of this should be clear. Okay, this is not important, the extension as such, but the core Pharma French model is very important from the exam perspective. Let us move forward towards the next chapter. Principles of risk data aggregation. In the past exam, I have heard students getting one question over here, but not so important. I don't feel this chapter is overall important for the exam. I'm just going to highlight few principles which you can focus when you're revising. Okay, you can read this part, why you need to look at data. With respect to the principles, I'm just going to move ahead directly to the principles part. Governance is okay. Data architecture and infrastructure is okay, not so important. Accuracy and integration, you can focus on this accuracy and integration part, the reading part. Okay, then there is timeliness, it can be important for the exam. Not 100% sure on the content which can get tested. Okay, the way it can get tested, I'm not very sure, but I'm just highlighting what I feel is important, could be important for the exam. From the reporting perspective, comprehensiveness can be important, so please make sure that you read it. Okay, next, clarity and usefulness is okay. Frequency can be tested, so please make sure that frequency, you're good with frequency also. Okay, I hope everybody is able to is with me till this point. I'm going to move towards the next chapter, enterprise risk management and ERM and the future trend. Over here, the basic definition of how ERM can help you. So you can read this entire paragraph. This will just summarize the difference between a silo approach and ERM approach. So you can read this section. Next, when we go towards the ERM best practices, corporate governance is important. This is the base of ERM. If you run ERM framework, there is corporate governance problem, you will not be able to succeed. Okay, so please make sure that it is good. ERM program dimension, in that there was one point, these two, strategies and culture. Focus more on that, these two pointers. The rest are also okay, but I feel they can test you on these concepts. Let us move towards the cultural part. Okay, now the key cultural indicators, all of them, just read the top four they have written. Please make sure that you are reading it properly for the exam from the chapter perspective. Then we can directly go towards the lot of theory general part. Okay, so you can focus on curves of the data. Okay, the cultural cycle part, and within sensitivity and scenario analysis, advantage, disadvantage. You can focus more on disadvantage of scenario. I feel they can test you more over here. From the next section, which is the next learning objective, 8.f, the baseline adverse and severely adverse. Please make sure that you are good with that. You are reading this, okay? They can ask you some question over here. Cocoa bonds, what happens in a cocoa bond is important as a perspective. Why companies want to use it? Why regulators are also preferring to cocoa bond? That is important. Rest is okay. Rest is not so important for the exam perspective. Let us move towards the next book, next part, learning from financial disaster. Overall, this chapter is important. Huh? So please make sure that you don't skip the chapter. Okay, there are few important case studies which I will highlight. As we move ahead, the first concept is interest rate related risk that we see in that, not nothing much important. Liquidity risk, you should read about Lehman Brother definitely. Okay, because it is with the recent case that we have seen. Lehman Brother is important. As we move ahead, Northern Rock is also important. In level 2, you will see Northern Rock again. So please read it properly from the exam perspective. Next is hedging strategy perspective. There is metal gazelle shaft. So over here, they're just talking about what is static, what is dynamic part, but case study is important. They might ask you MG case study. Very, very most likely they will ask you this. Okay, the stack and roll edging is important. You should know what is happening in stack and roll. We have done one, I have created one YouTube video also on this short video only on MG. So you guys can look at that. Also, it will simplify the entire case study for you. Next, apart from MG, we can look at long-term capital management. I've heard a lot of them being tested on these MG and long-term capital management in the exam. The entire overall case study, you should be good with that. Okay. Next is London Wales, not so. I don't feel it is very important. Bearing banks, favorite institute generally ask this question. They will combine it with some other case and they will ask. Okay, so I've heard historically also bearing bank is important from the exam perspective. Moving ahead, other bankers trust not so important. Orange County also. One or two students might get Orange County, but not everybody at an overall level. There is one more case which is Enron can be important, but not. I'm not very sure on Enron. Cyber risk, very very important. Please make sure that you are focusing on this. Okay. Swift case. This case is very well known, very discussed case. So please, you don't skip on this. They can ask you. This is a new trends, new risk that in operational risk people are facing, banks are facing. Okay. So with this, we are moving towards the next chapter, which is the we have completed learning from financial disaster, anatomy of great financial crisis, important double star chapter from the exam perspective. Within that, I'll just highlight which paragraph, which section you should focus on. Subprime mortgage and collateral section, this part, you can read the concept of teaser rate. Please make sure. I hope everybody is marking. Okay, or else you'll forget, definitely. So please write it down. Mm, Waterfall structure is important. Tranches in the waterfall structure. What is happening in waterfall? How the money comes and flow? That broader view you should be having. Short-term funding part. This part, commercial paper and how they were using it. One second. There's a paragraph. So you can read from here. Important. till this entire part actually. Because this was one of the major reason ABCPs, asset backed commercial paper, how SIVs were raising money from the market, so how the asset liability mismatch was happening. This is important, so don't skip this. Okay, interbank intervention. Not I'm not very sure of these four pointers, but if you're reading, just have a look at it. How the policy intervention happened. Very less chances because they might test you more on the asset liability mismatch from this chapter. Okay. We are moving ahead towards the next chapter, which is our code of conduct. Now, over here, if you read the chapter, you will not be able to solve direct questions. I mean, this chapter is more theoretical. Okay. And when you go to the concepts or the question, it is more subjective. It is more case study based part. Okay. I'm just still going to highlight few parts which I feel can be important from the exam perspective, but obviously there it's more subjective in nature. So this part, which is not offer, solicit, or accept gift, very most likely they ask questions, students on that. Okay, misrepresentation could be tested. Cultural difference part could be tested. Full and fair disclosure, conflict of interest part could be tested in case study. Confidentiality, not very sure, but you can mark 3.1. Fundamental responsibility, within fundamental responsibility, best practices ensure communication. Distinction between fact and opinion is can get tested. Okay, violation, what happens when you violate the car code of conduct. Okay, so that is there. So with this we have completed the first book. Are you guys, are you all with me? Can I get a quick confirmation? Please mention good to go in the chat so that we can start with the second book. I hope everybody is making the marking and highlighting in the book. सब लोग हैं मेरे साथ में? Okay, Yogesh, thank you. Let us move ahead, other people, towards the next book, quantitative analysis. A lot of people are afraid of this book. Okay, we'll try to highlight parts which you can focus on from the exam perspective. Let us go towards the index first. Okay, from the exam perspective, I've heard this chapter, even though this chapter seems easy, two or three questions are asked in this chapter, slightly tough questions. So I'm just giving you a heads up. This is what a feedback I've got from people. Okay. In some cases, they have connected this chapter with the multivariate random variable chapter also. Okay. So you can see some question like that. This common univariate chapter is important. I've released one more video on important chapters. I've not explicitly highlighted this chapter, but when you look at the overall book, this is slightly important. You can focus on this chapter. Okay. Uh, then hypothesis testing is very important because this is the base of the next part or the next two chapters, and regression diagnostic is very important. Further, stationary, non-stationary, I'll highlight which sections might be important. Simulation and bootstrapping overall level is important. Let us move toward the first chapter, which is the fundamental of probability section. Directly going to that chapter now. Perfect. So basics of probability, you all must have heard about it in school and college. Okay, so the first page, not so interesting, very basic part. This part, independent, how do we identify whether an event is independent or not? There's a separate video which I've done, the entire chapter I've covered in an easy manner, fundamentals of probability. You can check that video, that is also there. Next, conditionally independent, not important. Joint probability, this part. How do they calculate this joint probability? The logic has to be clear. If you're able to create a tree, then this will not be a challenge for you. Okay, Bayes rule. When I'm saying difficult question, a lot of students they got Bayes rule related difficult questions in the exam. So please make sure that you're good with the concept. You're good with the formula. Okay, marking this as star. Rest everything is not very tough for the exam from this chapter, but when you read it is not tough, but in the exam they are making it slightly complicated. Let us move towards the next part, next chapter, which is your random variable. Okay, so random variable is a building block for the next chapter, which is common univariate, because in this chapter they're telling you what is discrete, what is continuous, and all of that. So as I move ahead, I'm just going to move to the important section which I feel can get tested. So expectation is again basic mathematics that they're asking you. You can focus on these two, the properties of expectation from the exam perspective. Next, skewness kurtosis. Third, don't worry, they will not ask you the calculation of skewness, calculation of kurtosis, no. But what is happening in that and what exactly is skewness, what it tells you, that is important. Okay, so that concept has to be clear. Next, right skewed, left skewed. Okay, this diagram is important. Okay, and there is a paragraph which talks about this diagram, this paragraph. Okay, they are basically telling you that how kurtosis will lead to a fat tails on both the sides. That is important. And this paragraph, this section will come again in one of the next one of the chapters in book two also. PDF probability density function, quantile function. Okay, there is this interquantile range. This you can quantile function you can focus more from this chapter. What does it talks about? Okay, what is median? What is interquantile range? All of this you should be clear on. Linear transformation I don't expect as such, but you should broadly aware of what is happening. And in this also, these 3 pointers you can remember. Okay, I don't expect linear transformation being heavily tested, but if you're reading, then read these 3 pointers. Okay, we are going to move towards the next part, which is the common univariate random variable. Important, there are certain explicitly sections in this chapter which can get tested. Okay, so let us move towards the continuous uniform distribution, not very less chances that they might test you. Bernoulli also very less chances. Binomial, historically they have been tested. Okay, and when I'm saying testing, it means I feel most of the student might get tested on this. Okay, binomial, all of them, the formula, the calculation, everything you should be good with. Okay, all the formulas, this also, variance and expectation. Then Poisson is important from the exam perspective. This has been a favorite of GARP to ask questions on these topics. Okay, over here you can expect calculation based questions. Okay, chances that they might ask you good calculation based questions. Next, normal and log normal distribution. Over here, the properties of normal distribution, the formula is not important. Properties, okay, they might test you on that. Okay, some questions might come. Confidence interval, not very likely, but these numbers are important. Okay, the two-tailed numbers, which when you go to hypothesis testing, they are also repeated over there. So please make sure that you're good with that numbers. And this part, the standard normal distribution, the entire standardization part, how do you solve questions? That is tested heavily in the exam. So please make sure that you are good with that. Okay, let us move forward towards the next section. More or less, this is just a repeat of that part. Log normal, you can focus over here. Why? What is the difference between a log normal and a normal distribution? Student T distribution is also important. Okay, primarily this part. Okay, when I'm saying this, the why exactly it is being highlighted. Now, obviously, the content in the book is not structured because this part, which you see over here, it is more or less connected to hypothesis testing, which is going to come 2, 3 chapters later. Okay, table, you should know how to get the values from the table. I've not heard students being tested heavily from this perspective, so not so likely. This part, this diagram, which says that as the degree of freedom increases, your student distribution becomes more of a normal distribution. Chi-square, very less chances that they might ask all of them. F, exponential distribution, very less chances. If they want to make it complicated, then they might go and test. Okay, or also see, if you look at these distribution, you can focus on exponential to a certain extent as compared to chi-square and f and beta. You can focus more on exponential distribution. Mixture of distribution not heavily tested. So just moving towards the next chapter. Multivariate random variable. This chapter is continuation of the fundamentals of probability chapter. Okay, if you're aware about the metrics, if you're aware about the uh, tree creation of probability tree, it becomes very easy. In this, I'm just going to highlight few chap concepts where you can focus on. Marginal probability is not that important. Conditional distribution is important. The conditional distribution you can focus from the exam perspective. You should be able to solve sums on that. Okay. Expectation of bivariate distribution. No, I don't expect. Covariance and correlation part. See the formulas. You should know what is the formula. What are the formulas talking about? Okay, the basics of the formula, not the derivation. Nobody is asking you the derivation. Okay, the correlation part. What exactly is correlation? And the correlation is always going to be between this and this, negative one, positive one. That part should be clear. Linear transformation. Over here, the first effect and the second effect is important. So I'm just marking it as star so you can read and make yourself comfortable with this. Variance of the weighted sum, this formula and this formula important. Okay, even though in the exam they might not ask you to calculate, but they might ask you theoretical aspect of it. So please make sure that you're good with it. Also, this sum which is connected to the formula. Further, this part, the logic, the diversification gives you when there is a lower correlation. That part. Conditional expectation. mm, Not likely, not, I don't think so. That is getting tested. IID is also not very important from the exam perspective. You can just read it for the reference point, but very less likely that they might ask you explicit questions on the basics of IID. Okay, because then you are entering into the details of statistics, which I don't think so is the intention of the chapter. Let us move towards the next part, which is a sample movement. Okay, sample movement is a base chapter for your hypothesis testing. Now, as we move ahead, okay, uh, there was one formula which basically asks you. I'm just going ahead because first part is not very important. This formula is important, and you should know why we are using n minus one for a sample, okay, and not divided by n. That logic you should be clear. Okay. Next is arithmetic mean. Okay, sum. These are all very simple sums. Okay, you should know why. What was the problem with mean? Why are we looking at median also? That you should be clear. Then point estimate and estimator you should focus on. Okay. Bias estimator overall level you don't need because unbiased means the average of the x bar should be equal to mu. Okay, they're explaining the same concept again. Okay, from the exam perspective, if you come over here, this part they are telling you why we are using n minus one. This is important. Okay, the concept of best linear unbiased estimator is important. Theoretically, they can ask you content related to the same. Theoretically, let us move towards the next part, estimating law of large number, center limit theorem, important. This part is also connected to your hypothesis testing. So please make sure that you guys are looking at that. Okay, the entire paragraph, entire section. Next, Skewness Kurtosis is okay. The basic part, uh, this section you should remember. Basically, it is connected to the diagrams. Okay, so if you are okay with these diagram, you might get theoretical question whether the mean is bigger, median is bigger, and they might give you case and ask you that a researcher has done some analysis whether the statement related to mean or median when it is positively skewed, is it correct or not? That way they can test you. Even though the concept might seem simple, but in the exam they might make it slightly complicated and ask that question, that part. Okay. Kurtosis, the logic of excess kurtosis and leptokurtic part is important. Again, the same diagram. This is important. This entire part is important. Okay. Why leptokurtic is more riskier for us? So that is important. Quantile estimate median. I don't expect questions to be coming from there. Okay. Interquantile range is important. from the exam perspective. You should focus on that. Next is covariance, variance. Calculation of covariance, they don't ask you, so don't worry. They generally focus on understanding of correlation because in the bank, correlation is primarily used. In your calculations, also correlation is used. So this section and this part you can test, you can read primarily. Co-skewness and co-kurtosis also, I have not heard they have been testing students on this, even though they have a full page, but not heard about it. Okay, so don't take the pressure of this section. Directly, let us move towards the next part. Yeah, so we are done with this chapter. We are going to move towards hypothesis testing. Now, again, mark this as important. The concept, there are huge lot of concepts which are important for linear regression also. Okay, first page, not so important. Null hypothesis. What is alternate hypothesis? This can be important. Choice of null, not so. Test statistic formula is important, and the standard error logic is important. So please make sure that you are good with that part. One tail, two tail test, not so critical. You should know obviously how to do hypothesis testing, but they might ask more on theory, I feel. Not They might not ask how to do hypothesis. They might not ask you to do hypothesis testing. So one tail, two tail at a broader level you should know, but type one, type two error very very important. You will hear about this in level two also. Hence, these you should be clear on what is happening. What is type one? What is type two? You should know what is power of test, and there is a table. This table you should be clear on, and this paragraph how impacting. If suppose we are increasing the type 1 error, what is going to have an impact on type 2 and what is going to be impact on power of test, that relationship you should know. So I'm marking all of this as important. Confidence interval can get tested but not very very important. You can expect a theory over here. Okay, why statistical significant thing might not be matching with the practical part. So why we cannot implement it in practical life. That section you should focus on. P-value, very, very important. From the linear regression chapter perspective, also very, very important. Everything related to p-value is important. This diagram also. Okay, confidence interval is okay. T-test, Z-test, repeat. This table is important. Please make sure that you are comfortable with the table. Over here, you can read this section. What they are trying to highlight, if you have huge sample size, then in that case using z test or t test might not make much of a difference. Okay, so that part is there. Testing of equality is not tested in the exam heavily. Multiple hypothesis is also not tested. We're going to move towards the next chapter, which is the linear regression. Okay, from the exam perspective, okay, linear regression, there are few concepts in linear regression which can get tested. Okay, the regression conditions, these 3 points, important. Next, the OLS regression, the formula. This is the base, this is the beta formula itself. So you should remember it. Both the formula and this part is easy, not so important. Dummy variable is also not tested directly. This section, R square and the formula for R square, the ESS upon TSS part. You should focus on the that formula also. Don't miss that, okay? Assumptions of a linear regression. Again, marking it as star, important. All the assumptions. Okay, especially this error is constant and this part, expected value of the error term. This is important. These two are heavily important. Variance of the error, that is homoscedasticity, heteroscedasticity part, and the expected value of the error term, that is important. Properties of OLS, more or less repeat, unbiased and all. Hypothesis testing. Ha. In this section, actually, you have they're implementing hypothesis testing or linear regression to understand which independent variable is actually a hero and actually able to explain. Over here, they have not got much into detail, but this part, how you can use p-value in a regression to do hypothesis testing. That is important. So I've just highlighted that part. I'm going to move towards the next chapter where we are entering into regression with multiple independent variables. Over here also few sections are important, marking that also for you guys to revise it properly. The assumption, this assumption is important. This is an extra assumption that you see in multiple regression, not in single regression. Okay, so you should be clear on that part. Rest all is more or less repeat. This section where they're saying when you add in more independent variable, your betas changes. Why it changes? That logic has to be clear. Next, we are moving toward the next module, which is 19.2. This is where the regression starts coming in. Standard error of regression as a concept. You should be clear. The TSS upon ESS part should be clear. This diagram is important. Okay. Coefficient of determination, this entire part is important. And the theory related to R square is important. Adjusted R square, I don't expect formula being tested in the exam, but you should know why are we using adjusted R square. That part is important. And they might ask you this question. They might give you numbers and tell which model to choose. Okay, that can come in the exam. So please make sure that you are okay with that part. Joint hypothesis testing section, defining statistical significance is okay. Within F test, now this question. Okay, 1 second. What happened? Yeah. So when we are looking at hypothesis testing, this question you might expect. There was small glitch, so don't worry. We are still continuing with the book. This question, which is F statistic related question, this can get tested in your exam heavily. Okay, so please make sure that you're comfortable with the formula, with the entire hypothesis approach. So don't skip this, okay, when you're looking at the book too. Next, let us try to go towards the next chapter, which is regression diagnostic, marking the entire chapter as important. Okay, why? Because the heteroscedasticity is tested in the exam. Heteroscedasticity is heavily tested in the exam. Conditional heteroscedasticity, you should know what is hetero and homoscedasticity. This paragraph is important. Okay, this diagram is important because they might show you a diagram and say which model will you choose, like that. Effect of heteroscedasticity is important. Moving further, correcting heteroscedasticity is not important. Multicolinarity. What is multicolinarity is important. How does it affect and detection? This question has been tested in the past exam. The same kind of questions have been tested in the past exams. So please make sure that you're comfortable with this part. Also, VIF is important. That is why there are so many important concepts. That's the reason I said please make sure that you're comfortable with this entire chapter. Variance inflation indicator is important. Marking it as double star. Okay. Not the calculation as such. They might give you the number. Okay. They might give you the R square and ask you to calculate, and then you will have to give the final answer. Moving ahead, model specification part, omitted variable. This section is somewhat important, so you should read it. Next is this variance trade-off. What happens when you take very small number of variables? What happens when you take huge number of variables into the section? So that is why this becomes important. Identifying outlier. This part, Cook's measure, is important from the exam perspective. Rest. This entire chapter is important. So I'm just highlighting important section, but you should focus on this chapter properly. Let us move toward the time series chapter from book 2. Okay, when we talk about time series, the covariance stationary, the rules of covariance stationaries are very, very important. Do not skip that. Okay, you should be clear, you should have a clear understanding of that. Autocorrelation function, it's okay. These two lines are important, marking it as star, and the diagram should know what is happening in the diagram. Then we will move towards white noise. So over here, the entire concept of white noise is important from the understanding perspective. And this paragraph, how you can connect it back to regression, concept of white noise. Okay, this is important. Moving forward, AR1, marking it as star, autoregressive process model. Okay, in that the long run average, long run mean reverting part, you should be clear. There's more chances that they might test you on the mean, not on the variance. Okay, mean questions might come. Ewell-Walker equation, Ewell-Walker is also important, my bad. The formula, I'm talking about the formula. MA, it's not that important as compared to AR from the chapter. Very, very less chances that they might ask you questions over here with respect to MA. So I'm just moving ahead. If you want to read MA, then you can focus on this formula only. The concept of autocorrelation cutoff. Okay. Lag operator also not very, very important from the exam perspective. Arma model, yes. The Arma model and the formula, the way the Arma model is structured, you should be clear on that part. You should be clear on this paragraph also. Read the professor's note also over here. Application of Arma, and so this part, okay, how would you use how would you choose which model to use, AR, MA, or Arma? That is important. This paragraph is important from the exam perspective. Testing autocorrelation, not very, very important. We are going to move towards the non-stationary time series now. We're going to move towards the non-stationary time series. Time trend, fairly simple, easy part. This section you should not miss. Why don't we use linear time trend heavily? Okay, that part, that section. I'm just going back. This paragraph, the 2 points are important, so please don't skip it. Moving towards more or less, it's a repeat, not so important. Seasonality as a concept. Seasonality and dummy variable. Please mark it as double star. Everything, this entire part, okay, and this sum, important. Don't skip that, okay? Rest, everything is okay. Unit root, you can skip, very less likely that they might test you. Dickey-Fuller test, also not so important. This part, within Dickey-Fuller test, you can actually read this entire section, the last learning objective properly, okay? And the last paragraph is important. They might test you on in the exam in theoretical format. Okay, let us move towards the next chapter, which is your measuring return, volatility, and correlation. So basically, there are three parts to it. The return part is not heavily tested. Volatility part is also not heavily tested. This section can be important where they're saying the square root rule for using sigma. That can be important. Moving towards normal, log normal, JB test, very, very important. Please mark it as star. Okay, JB test. You should be clear on what is happening over here. They don't ask you this calculation. I don't expect that. But how they are running the hypothesis, that is important. Okay, but at an overall level, please make sure that you are confident on the JB test. It has been tested in the last few exams also. Power law, not so important. Pearson correlation. Rank correlation was tested previously. So marking rank correlation as star, double star, even though you might be afraid of this candle star correlation. Okay, but I have seen Spearman rank correlation being tested heavily in the exam. So marking that as star, Spearman rank correlation. Okay. Rest, then this chapter is done. Positive definitiveness is not important. We are directly going to simulation and bootstrapping now. We are going to simulation and bootstrapping. Okay. Now, in this chapter, the bootstrapping part is slightly important. The process of simulation, they might not be able to test you. This section, reducing Monte Carlo simulation error, this entire part, okay, I expect they might test you. Okay, antithetic variate part, not so important. Control variate also not so important. bootstrapping methodology in this, the IID bootstrapping. But what is happening over here? That is what you should be remembering. And the circular block, the logic. You should be clear on the logic and these part. Why are we using? What is the problem with bootstrapping? Double star, marking this as double star. Very, very important for the exam. Next, random number generator, not so important. Disadvantage also not so important. So we are done with book two. Are we guys with me till this point? Can I get a quick confirmation on chat? Good. On the chat, everybody, so that we can move towards the next book. क्या लगता है? Are we guys good till this point? Okay, let us move towards the next section, which is your book three. A lot of people are confident on this book three. I'm just going to zoom out. A lot of people are confident on book three. Okay, let us start talking about it. From the exam perspective, there are 30 questions that can come from this book. From the important chapter perspective, fund management, derivative, exchange and OTC. As per the chapter perspective, not very important. There are few sections which can get tested. Using future for hedging, important. Don't skip this chapter. Okay, from the both of them important. Okay, pricing, financial forwards and commodity. Properties of option, very, very important. Entire chapter is important. To a certain extent, there are certain strategies in trading strategy which can be used. Corporate bond, I have heard in the last exam, people have been asked on this. Okay, so it can get tested. Over here, duration and convexity is important. And mortgage and mortgage-backed security. This is good, important chapter. And swap chapter is also important. Okay, so we will move towards the first chapter now, the banks, and let us see what is slightly important from the exam perspective, and we can try looking at that also. Banks chapter, major risk which is being faced by the bank. So you can read this part, major risk which is being faced. Then Basel Committee recommendation, this part, the net stable funding ratio, and the liquidity coverage ratio. You should definitely be good with that. Moral hazard as a concept, you should know, okay, at an overall level. Investment banking, financing arrangement, IPO, Dutch auction, along with calculation. Then you might get calculation based questions over here. So please make sure that you're good with it. Conflict of interest, the first two paragraph, important. Banking book versus trading book, okay. Original to distribute model is again going to get covered in the mortgage and mortgage-backed security. So not so important that part. So I've just highlighted few sections over here which can be important for your exam perspective. Next section, insurance companies and pension plan. Life insurance, very theoretical. This part is important. You might get some theory over here. Annuity contract, property and casualty. These are basic part, okay? The risk which is faced by the insurance company, you can expect a theoretical question over here. Mortality table. Okay, so over here, generally I don't expect this part is not so important. I don't expect direct questions to be there. Okay, I expect this question, the break-even principal premium, important. So don't skip this. Okay, break-even premium is very, very important. PNC ratios, marking it as star, important. Rest, moral hazard, adverse selection is okay. Longevity risk is okay. Capital requirement, you can read this part. Guaranteed system for insurance, okay. Defined benefit and defined contribution plan. You should read a defined benefit plan for the exam perspective. Let us move towards the next section, which is your fund management. Okay, fund management chapter. Basics of mutual fund and hedge fund, open-ended fund, theory, not so important. Net asset value theory, Front end and back end load can be tested, so please make sure that you're good at it. Close-ended fund is okay. Exchange traded fund you should read definitely. Mark it as star. Undesirable trading behavior. This has been tested in the past exams. Okay. Direct questions asking you the concept. So marking this as double, triple star. Don't skip this. Don't skip this from this chapter. Make sure that you're good with what is late trading, what is market timing, what is front running, all of that. Okay. The calculation of net asset value is not so important. Directly taking you towards the hedge fund incentive part, this section, important. Don't skip it. 2 plus 20%, theoretically they can ask you questions. Okay, and also the concept of high watermark clause, important. Okay, next as we move ahead, hedge fund strategies, distressed debt, dedicated short, merger arbitrage, important strategy. This is also going to come in your level 2. Okay, convertible arbitrage is okay, emerging fund is okay, more or less same thing. You can read this part, the last part also properly. Measurement and the backfill bias. Okay, so with this, we have completed the insurance chapter. I'm going to move towards the next section, which is introduction to derivative. This sector is on its own not very important, but this is a base. If you don't know this, every other entire futures option, you won't be able to do it. Okay, so over here, linear, non-linear derivative. Okay, these are basics of futures and options. Direct questions might not come over here. They might not ask you direct question on calculate what is call, what is the payoff of the call option. No, very, very less chances that they might ask you like that. So first part of the chapter is not so important. You can read this section to understand different players in the market, and you can read these two paragraphs also. You can read the speculative strategy paragraph. Questions, I'm not highlighting it as important as such. If you have time, then only look into it, or else more or less they might check on the understanding perspective. Arbitrage is also okay. Risk is also okay. We are moving towards the next chapter now. Futures market. Sorry, exchange and OTC market. My bad. Exchange and OTC market. Clearing initial margin. I'm highlighting this paragraph. The first paragraph of the clearing. Should read it definitely. Netting part. The multilateral netting is important. When we go towards margining, so variation margin is important, and this paragraph is important. Marking this paragraph as star. Default fund contribution is very important from the exam perspective. They can test you in the understanding part. Okay. Next, over the counter derivative part, repeat, more or less repeat. Classes of derivative not, we might not test. Over here, the last part, which is the mitigating risk of the OTC derivative. Over here, this buying on margin is important and short selling is important. I expect one question. If they want to test you, they can. Few students might get tested on this. Okay, so think it that way. Both the part. Market as star. Okay, important. Collateralization is okay. SPV is okay. I don't expect them to be tested heavily. Next, central clearing. When we talk about central clearing, auction, loss mutualization as a concept is important. Should know what is happening over there. CCP and OTC, okay. Advantages and disadvantages of central clearing. Don't miss this. Okay, marking this as star, both of them. I'm marking this as star. So please, you should know what is happening with respect to the disadvantages. Regulatory initiatives. Now, over here, these three initiatives should know. Okay, so you can read these factors. Margining is okay. Novation. Novation as a concept you should know. Novation as a concept you should know for the exam. Impact of central clearing is almost there. Okay. So we are now moving towards the default risk. Now over here, this part, the types of risk that you CCP face, the default risk is very, very important, especially the VMGH logic. So this entire part is important. Don't skip that. Okay. From the exam perspective, don't skip that. Liquidity risk. Okay. Operation risk is also not that important. Risk of clearing member. So not so important. I'm just going to move towards the next chapter. Futures market. Okay. Long, short, day trading, open interest. You should know. So you can read this entire paragraph properly. Key features of the futures in that: price quote, price limit, and there is one more. Position limit nahi hai. Contract size. You guys can focus on these, especially price quote and price limit. Very important. Spot price convergence. Okay. Now you can mark this question as star. Understanding perspective. This will help you to understand what is basis and basis risk. Margin requirement, double star. Every other exam I have asked, they have asked this question. Okay, margin requirement. This entire sum is important. Initial margin and variation margin in futures market. Very, very important. Next, exchange futures quote. Not so important. Just directly moving towards the next part. Normal and inverted market. This concept is important. Delivery process, important. Very, very important. The entire delivery process you should know. They can ask you theoretical questions over here. Types of trading order in that these two paragraph is important. Limit order and stop order. Okay. Mark to market hedging, not so important. Exchange and difference, not so important. We are going to move towards using hedging, using futures for hedging. Double star, very important. Almost everything is important in this chapter. Okay. Especially the optimal hedge ratio and all of that. Disadvantage. One second. There is one part which is this paragraph. You should not forget this part. You should read this section by default. Basis risk, very, very important. I'm marking it as double star. Why do we face basis risk? That is also important. Okay. This entire section is important. Optimal hedge ratio, it has been tested. The same simple questions have been tested in the past exam. So don't skip that optimal hedge ratio. Next, hedging stocks with futures, marking this question as star. Okay, like I said, the entire chapter is important. Adjusting the portfolio beta has also been tested in the past exams. So definitely a double star. Okay. Rolling the hedge is okay. We're going to move towards the next chapter now. I hope everybody is with me. Foreign exchange market, spot rate, future rate, this part, the forward rate. This forward quote is important. Forward quote is important. Transaction risk, this part, transaction risk and the translation risk. Don't skip that. Okay. Multi-currency hedging is okay. Exchange rate drivers, okay. Currency appreciation and depreciation. This entire part, marking it as star. Purchasing power parity, nominal rate and real rate impact. Marking this section important. Then the formula for interest rate parity is important. And this paragraph is important. Don't skip that. From the exam perspective, this sum is also important. You can expect a similar type of questions over here. Covered, uncovered is not important from the exam perspective. I don't expect questions to be tested over there. One or two students might get, but no, I'm not talking about the general public. Okay, pricing financial forwards and futures important. Okay, in this short selling is okay. This part, pricing forward price with no yield. This formula, the arbitrage part, everything is important. With income, important. You can expect a question, direct question. Effect of yield is also important. Value of forward contract, I don't think so. They will ask you. This will make the question slightly big. So I don't think so. They will ask you. Moving towards this formula is already covered in the previous chapter. Stock index futures, okay, done. So in this chapter, these three formulas are important, and then don't just look at from the formula perspective. Please understand the concept because they might ask you theory also. Let us go to commodity forwards and futures. Commodity forwards and futures. Over here, why there is a need? Why do we look at normal investment asset differently and commodity differently? So this part is important. Under the commodities part, this part, natural gas and electricity is tested heavily. I've heard it is being tested heavily. Forward pricing, uh, the basic approach, this part is not so important. Commodity arbitrage, the cash and carry arbitrage logic, and the reverse cash and carry. This is important. Okay. This sum is important, which is cash and carry. And if you understand the concepts, now this is not tough. Reverse cash and carry is also important. Marking this a star. Lease rate is okay. Convenience yield is important. What is convenience yield? Okay, the formula, this is important. Expected spot price, yes. Backwardation and contango is important. Again, this entire chapter more or less seems to be important, so don't skip anything over here. Let's move to commodity. We have done commodity forwards and futures. We are going to move towards the next chapter, which is going to be options market. Now, some of the content is repeat from the introduction to derivative part. So if you have done that introduction to derivative properly, then you can skip all of this. You can skip what are the basics of call, what are the basics of put. Okay, even if you don't read these pages, you'll be good. You'll not miss anything. Underlying part, more or less simple. I don't expect anything explicitly important from the exam perspective. Expiry part is not important. Stock prices, flex, effect of dividend, very important. Mark this as star. Okay, so they can ask you calculation based questions also here. Trading. Okay, trading position limit. Okay, commission. I don't expect straightforward commission based questions coming in. You can read this paragraph, mark it as star. Margin requirement, you can read properly. Okay, from the exam perspective. Exercising an option is okay. Yes. What are the difference? Option, other option like stock like security. Marking that as star. From the understanding perspective, they can ask you questions over here. Let us move toward the next section, the next chapter, which is properties of options. I'm marking this entire chapter as star. Everything in this chapter is important, so don't skip anything. I'm not going to highlight anything in this chapter. Entire chapter you should be confident on. Okay, each and every part you should be confident on. Okay, I'm just moving quickly towards the next chapter. Trading strategies. Okay, now over here, the protective put call might not be tested. Principal protected note. This principal protected note, their logic is important. Okay, so don't skip that. Moving towards the option spread. So bull spread and call bear spread. They are important, but when you compare other strategies, okay, butterfly spread is more important as compared to these two. But I'm just highlighting that, okay, this is also significantly there. Important part is your butterfly option, butterfly spread. Almost every other students might see this kind of question being tested in the exams because by testing this, they are actually testing you the basics of all the call put in one go. So it becomes easy for the institute to test you that in that manner. So everything related to butterfly spread, you should be clear. Calendar spread is okay. Box spread is, I don't think so. Box spread will be tested heavily. Straddle, very, very important. Don't miss that. Okay. Straddle, the logic of straddle. Why are you entering into straddle? Okay. The sum related to straddle important. Rest, strip and strap, you can also mark it. But again, there are other strategies which can get tested as compared to strip and strap. Let us move towards the next chapter, which is exotic option. In the exotic option, I'm directly, the first few parts are straightforward, easy. I don't expect them to be tested in the exam. Bermuda option, mark this as star. Okay, it can get tested. Bermuda option and this also, the lockout period part. Okay, the non-standard options. Gap option important, mark this as star. Very, very important from the exam perspective. Everything related to gap option, you should be clear. Forward start is okay. Compound is okay. Barrier option, important from the exam perspective. Okay. Binary option, important. Everything is important from the exam perspective. Rest, look back, not so important. Exchange, volatility, exchange option, volatility swap, static. Rest, everything you can just read, but I've just highlighted few important chapters that you can focus on. Let us go towards the next chapter, which is your properties of interest rate. Now, over here, the discussion on overnight index swap is okay, it's needed. Compounding frequency, I don't see people being tested on the calculation part over here. Continuous rate, okay, this seems to be okay. Bond pricing, the bond pricing is not tested directly. Huh? They would not, very, very less chances that they would give you a simple bond pricing question because everybody will be able to solve it. Okay, so I don't expect that to happen. Okay, the concept of par yield is slightly important. Bootstrapping, even if you get a question like this in the exam, you have to be smart. Okay, don't do it at the start, do it at the end because it is going to be time consuming. Ideally, I have not heard bootstrapping also being tested heavily in the exam. Forward rate is important. How do we calculate forward rate? The formula is important. Okay, FRA is also being tested in the exam. So please make sure that you're good with FRA also. Okay, term structure theory is not so likely to be tested. Duration and convexity. Wherever you see this, it is also there in book 4. There is one chapter applying duration, convexity, DV01. Important. Market is start. Entire thing. You should be clear on what is duration, what is convexity. Okay, the duration effect, the convexity effect, the diagram. You should be clear. This sum is a favorite. Okay, marking this as double star. So don't skip that part. Okay, properties of interest rate also. We are done. We are going to move towards the next chapter, which is corporate bond. Now, historically, on the corporate bond, they have not been tested. In the last 1 or 2 exams, I've heard about corporate bond being tested, and most likely they might test you in this. Okay, the first page, that section. Then there is a lot of basic of bond part. How do we classify bond? Zero coupon bond. This section can be tested. The reinvestment risk, mortgage bond, collateral bond, equipment trust certificate can be tested. Important. Subordinate bond can be tested if they want to test it. Right. I don't know what is going to happen with this chapter because in the only past 2 exams I have heard about it. Fixed price call, okay. Sinking fund provision you can test. Read this part properly. Credit default part. 1 second. High yield bond. You can read this part. Credit default risk and credit spread risk. You can read these 2 parts. High yield bond recovery rate is okay. This, I think so. One of the student told me about this dollar default rate formula being tested. Okay, so that's the reason I'm just highlighting this. Expected return, this formula. This formula is important. Mark this as star. Risk rate plus credit spread minus expected loss. Okay, please make sure that you are good with this section. We are moving ahead now. Mortgage and mortgage-backed security. There are few parts in this chapter which are important, so I'm just going to highlight that. Mortgage-backed security. Starting part is fairly simple and easy. Fixed rate level payment mortgage is not important. This diagram is important. Okay, so please make sure that you are comfortable with the diagram. The first diagram. Then as we move through pass-through security, this section, mark this as star, weighted average maturity, weighted average coupon, prepayment speed, very, very important. Every other exam they ask you. CPR, SMM, the calculation, it is very, very important. Please don't skip it. Okay. If you're reading this chapter, you should be focusing on this part. The sum also. Everything is important. As we move ahead, pass through TBA dollar roll transaction. How to value a dollar roll transaction? Important. Don't skip this. Okay, agency MBS, collateralized mortgage, planned part. Pack is slightly important. They might ask you on theoretical part, entire pack. Principal only, interest only. I've not heard in the last two exams they've been testing on this. Prepayment modeling, you can skip more or less. It is not that important. They're just explaining you the theoretical part. Incentive function, you can mark as star, the formula and the incentive function, the entire thing, important. There's also option adjusted spread, which is slightly important. Curtailment, okay. Option adjusted spread is important. I'm marking this as star. Okay. The size of this chapter is slightly big. Okay. And then we are going to move towards the next chapter, which is swaps. Okay. I'm directly moving towards the next chapter. Sorry, interest rate futures. My bad. I missed that. In the interest rate futures, the accrued interest calculation, very, very important. Marking it as double star. This sum, double star. Historically, they have been testing this section. Quotation for T bond, this clean price, dirty price, this logic is important. T bill is okay. They have not been testing heavily. Cash price, conversion factor, not tested. Cheapest to deliver bond, every exam they try to test you somewhere on this cheapest to deliver bond to make sure that you are okay with it. Mark it as double star. Treasury bond futures also not so important. Euro dollar, you can mark this formula, and euro dollar, this formula part you should know, and $25 part. Okay, forward price is okay. Duration based hedging, yes. This entire sum, mark it as star. Previously, they have been testing on this. Let us move towards the swap part, the swap chapter, which is the final chapter of book 3. Okay. First few sections are okay. They are very, very basic. So that is not important. Financial intermediary is okay. This part, comparative advantage, important. Mark this as star. Comparative advantage is important. Okay. You can also look at this question, which is testing the comparative advantage. Mark this as star. Discount rate is okay. Valuation of a bond. Okay. Valuation of a swap using a bond. Important. So basically the calculation part, most of the time they test on swap on calculation only. And they give you very simple basic sum. So this sum, and don't worry about the FRA approach. If you know the bond approach, FRA approach is okay. You can skip it because it's very lengthy. Don't take the pressure of, okay, I have skipped this entire page. It is not needed. Even without knowing this, you can clear the exam. Okay, currency swap, the question, this formula and the question, important. Okay. Next, again, in the currency swap, there is the second approach, which is using forward exchange rate. If you're not comfortable with it, that is also okay. Most likely, they will ask you a question on finding the value of a swap rather than the approach. So don't worry on that section. Swap credit risk. This paragraph you should know. Swap credit risk and equity swap is okay. Rest everything is okay as of now. So we are done with book 3. We are going to move towards book 4. I hope everybody is with me till this point. I'm going to quickly move towards the Fourth book, which is the valuation, one second, valuation and risk models. Okay, valuation and risk model. At an overall level, measure of financial risk is an important chapter. Calculating and applying VAR. There are few sections which are important. I will highlight it. Uh, External, internal, there is one sum which is generally tested. Country risk, okay, measuring expected and unexpected loss over here is important. Operation risk has been tested in the past two exams. I've heard about it. So please make sure that you are comfortable with this part. Pricing convention is okay, interest rate is okay. These two chapters you can focus on, marking it a star. Binomial tree and option Greek you can focus. I'll go towards each of the section now, talking about each chapter's important, which section I feel is important. Measure of financial risk, variance framework. This formula is a repeat of book two. Okay, so you should know about this. This is, if you have read the modern portfolio theory, this part is efficient frontier and all is repeat. You can know about this. More or less, this entire part is repeat. So not very important from this perspective, exam perspective. What is the problem with mean variance framework? Okay, these limitations are very important. Mark this as star. Okay, why we are not using mean variance framework as effectively as ideally we should be. Okay, this logic, this diagram, and this logic is important. Why having a skewed distribution can be problematic if you have assumed a normal distribution. Okay, the basic formula for VAR calculation and this sum, very important. Delta normal VAR, very important. Okay, next limitation. One second, there's some technical glitch. Okay, limitation, summarization. This summarization is important. Okay, I hope everybody is with me till this point. Coherent risk measure, these four pointers are important. These four pointers are important. Do not skip, especially the concept of sub-additivity. Important. Expected shortfall. How do you calculate expected shortfall? Not the formula, but the logic. It should be, you guys should be comfortable with that part. Okay. Moving ahead. For rest, everything is okay from this chapter. Let us move forward towards the next section. The next chapter, which is calculating and applying VAR. Okay, over here, non-linear derivative. This diagram is important because if you are aware about this, you will be able to understand things very fast between the call price function, the gamma effect, and all. So for this formula is important. Okay, for linear derivative, historical simulation, this part, marking it as star. Delta normal approach, repeat of more or less same thing. You can read this paragraph, these two paragraphs, mark it as star. More or less, these formulas are repeat, nothing new. If you have done the previous chapter, this chapter is more or less repeat. Gamma section, you can read this diagram, this paragraph, and this section. Okay, important. Moving towards a Monte Carlo approach, not so important. This part is important. This is nothing but uh, the square root rule, where you have a var of 1 day, you want to calculate for entire year, you just multiply and get the square root section. Stress testing var is okay. Yes, you can focus on this paragraph, contingent effect. The rest worst case logic is okay. Moving toward the third chapter, measuring and monitoring volatility. Okay, value at risk, basic. What is a deviation? What leads to the deviation from normality? Fat scale, skewed, and unstable. Read this entire section. Read this entire section. Regime switching is okay, not important. Conditional, unconditional is not important. Estimating Parametric and non-parametric approach, not important. Historical simulation, important. Mark it a star. High chances that they might test you. This sum also. Okay. Then estimating volatility and mean reversion, decently okay. EWMM, double star. This formula, not this, huh? This formula is important. Okay, the sum is important. You should know what is the logic. EWMI, you should be very, very clear. High chances that they will test you. Okay. One benefit of the model is this. Garch also very, very favorite model of the uh, examiner. So you should be clear on the entire EWMI and the Garch part. Some for Garch, I don't think so. They might test you. More likely, they will test you on EWMI sums. Alternative weighted average approach is okay. Mean reversion and long time frame approach is okay. Implied volatility is okay. Updating correlation, not so important. I'm going to move ahead now towards the next chapter, which is your external internal rating. Now, in this chapter, primarily, okay, they've more talked more or less about the theory. There's some calculation also over here, which is nothing but how do they calculate cumulative and unconditional. From the exam, I don't expect them directly to ask you this. They will more likely test you on this section if they ask you in terms of the theory, okay, or else the hazard rate. Mark this a star. Hazard rate logic. Mark this a star. Okay. Expected non unexpected. This part is connected to expected loss, which is also covered in another chapter. So not very very important. As we move ahead, rating transition matrix double star. Very, very important. Every other exam I've heard about it. They are asking you this question, straightforward this question in the exam. So rating transition matrix, and this question is important. Anticipating rating change is okay. Rest everything is okay in this chapter, not very, very important. I'm going to move towards the next section now. Country risk, more or less theoretical, not so important part over here. This Porter's 5 model you can read. This paragraph you can highlight and read properly. Sovereign default, local default. This paragraph, why local default happens, is important. Consequences of sovereign default, okay. Rest more or less theoretical. I don't expect this to happen. Sovereign default, this paragraph, and CDS. You can read these sections from the exam perspective, important for the exam. I'm going to move towards the next section now. Measuring credit risk. Okay, over here you can expect questions in theory and calculation also. Regulatory capital part default is okay. PD, all of this is important. PD, LGD, and exposure at default. The formula important. This entire section is important. Okay, next we are just moving towards measuring credit losses and modeling. This part is okay, not heavily tested. This alpha part, this formula can get tested. Okay, not very high chances, but still, I mean, comparatively, you can focus. Cautions cupola, you can skip, not skip in the sense that is not important. Okay, Weizsäck model. This part in the Weizsäck model is very, very important. They have been testing on this basic formula. I've heard questions being there. Okay, so that is there. Euler's theorem also, I don't expect questions to come. Challenges in assessing risk. This part you can read. Last part, marking it a star from the measuring credit risk perspective. Okay, I'm going to move towards the further part, which is related to operational risk. Like I said, this chapter has been tested in the last two exams. You can read this part, marking it a star, and the cyber risk part and the rogue trader part. Important, marking this a star. Okay, basic indicator. important. AMA, and this diagram is important. You should know what is happening over here. Moving ahead, standardized measurement approach, not so important. Loss distribution, you should know which model is used for frequency, which model is used for log normal. You should know about it. Data limitation, potential biasness. Yes, this sum, this formula is double star. It is used in the exam. It is directly given. Straightforward questions are directly given. So don't skip that, okay? Don't skip that. Applying scenario analysis is okay. Operation risk management, forward-looking part, more or less theoretical, not so important. Allocating capital, power law, this part, moral hazard, you should read. Adverse selection, you should read. Taking you further towards the next section, stress testing. Okay. Now over here in the stress testing, there are few chunks which are important, few sections which are important. This part, marking this as star, knock-on effect and peripheral variables, important. Stressed part, yes, you can read this entire section, marking it as star. The responsibility of the board is okay, more or less theoretical. Policies, procedures, the document, theoretical. Principles, okay. More or less, this is what I feel is important from this chapter. I'm going to move towards the next chapter, which is pricing convention and discount arbitrage. Very, very basic chapter which talks about the bond valuation. So first few pages are not important. This diagram is important, and the relationship between price and yield is important from the understanding perspective. Discount factor. I've heard students getting some, okay, on this discount factor, okay, for the treasury bill and for the treasury. This sum is important. Treasury bond. Okay, determine the value of law of one price. Very, very unlikely that they might ask you arbitrage based questions. Slightly lengthy. That is why. And next part, bond component and pricing. Very unlikely that they might test. Replicating portfolio. I've not heard people getting this question, even though the calculation is very big. It is slightly tough. I've not heard about it. Next, dirty price, clean price. This is repeat of the interest rate futures chapter from your book three. Okay, so if you are aware about this, then this entire section is okay. There's nothing new. This part is important. Directly taking you towards the next section, which is interest rate. Compounding part, very unlikely that they might ask you on the basics of compounding and the formula in the exam. Okay, because this is very easy. Deriving spot rate, discount factor, not so important. Forward rate is important. Don't skip that. Whatever is there over here, you should be comfortable, and the sum you should be comfortable. Okay. Par rate, there is a formula which is connected to par. One second. Yes, I expect this formula to be tested in the exam. Okay, this sum. Okay. Further, relationship between spot and forward not heavily tested. Swap and swap rate. This is covered in your swap chapter very, very easily. It is covered. Notional principle, OIS, this part, LIBOR and OIS spread. You can look into this section. Yield curve shapes. First part is simple, easy. Yield curve twist. Okay, this part. From yield curve twist, marking this as star to this, important. I'm going to move towards the next chapter, which is bond return and yield part. Sorry, bond yield and return calculation. From this chapter, the gross yield, this reinvestment risk you can read. The rest more or less is easy. I don't expect them to be tested. Bond spread as a logic, you should be clear. They don't ask any calculation as such. YTM calculation is okay. periodic yield, perpetuity they might test. So I'm just highlighting this part. Spot rate and YTM is okay. Coupon effect, very, very important. Mark this as star. Double star, coupon effect. Okay, this entire understanding. Japanese yield, it has been tested. Mark this as double star. Japanese yield, the calculation. Don't skip it. Okay, bond return composition. This first page is okay. This part, you should know this part. Marking this as star, and the extension part. Marking this as also star. Carry roll down scenario. I think so. They are testing more on unchanged term structure in terms of theory in the exam. Okay, not the calculation based. I've not heard they are asking calculation as such. More or less theory. Applying DV01 duration important. Okay, because all these three components, duration, convexity, for a fixed income roles, these are very, very important. So you should definitely focus on the entire chapter. This is all important. DV01 calculation is important, marking this as star. Okay, this part, why do we see DV01 is not same? Marking this as star, important. Hedging use DV01, this is also being tested in historical exams heavily, so please make sure that you're comfortable with this. The sum is also important. Duration and convexity, when they combined, they are tested heavily. Okay, you should know what is happening in callable bond and a putable bond. So I'm just highlighting two paragraphs over here. Convexity formula is not tested. They don't ask you to calculate convexity. They don't ask you to calculate duration. I have not heard about it. Uh, this diagram, which explains you the relationship between duration and convexity, should be clear. This part, using both duration effect and convexity effect, is important. The sum is important. Okay, this formula, I have heard straightforward questions have come asking you to calculate the probability portfolio duration, weighted average, straightforward. I know this sums to be very easy, but this has also come in the exam. Okay, so please make sure that you are comfortable with this part. Hedging is okay. Hedging is okay. Not I've not heard people doing it. Barbell portfolio. Double star, very, very important. And straightforward questions they ask, straightforward. Okay, no change. So you can utilize the logic if you're clear and you can easily get one question in. This bubble portfolio is tested heavily in the previous exams also. Let us move towards the next chapter, modeling non-parallel shift. Term structure basically, chapter is slightly complex because they are more related to modeling part, but few sections you can focus on, like the principal component analysis. I'm marking this as star. Then factor score is okay. This logic of factor score can be tested out. So you can, I'm just marking this. Partial 01 is okay. Key rate shift. The, this concept of key rate 01 is more important. And the calculation of key rate 01 is important. Then we can move towards key rate exposure and hedging. This is okay, more or less not heavily tested. I have not heard about it. Forward bucket also have not heard about it. I'm not going to mark it as important as such. So if you have time, then definitely this chapter you should do it at the end. Okay, don't take the pressure of this chapter as such. You can remember this formula, marking this as star. Let us go to the next chapter, which is your binomial tree. Okay, within binomial tree, the first part not so important, risk neutral valuation not so important. They might ask you a very simple, straightforward question with respect to the valuation. That means this part, up and down. They might ask you to do one sum, one proper sum. Okay, this is mostly tested in binomial tree. Rest delta hedging, not I've not heard about it. Synthetic call replication, not heard about it. Even I've heard in exam that they are asking one step binomial tree, not two step. Okay, so that is also okay. Modifying the binomial tree, not tested as of now. I have not heard about it. one or maximum two students might have got this, but most of them, I generally expect they will ask binomial with American option, but historically in the exam they are ditching this and they're focusing on very simple binomial tree questions. Okay, so definitely this is there. Increasing the number, we are moving ahead. So only the very basic simple calculation of binomial tree, if you're okay, then I think so more or less the chapter you can move ahead with this chapter. Black-Scholes model. The next chapter, Black-Scholes model, log normal part. Okay, I think so. There was this logic, this formula, the return distribution, marking this as star. This was tested in one of the exams. Okay, so marking this as important. Expected return is okay. Realized return, historical volatility. This is nothing but your square root rule. So you can read this part. Assumptions of Black-Scholes model is very, very important. Don't skip this. This is being tested in the exam. Okay, the formula for call is important. If they want to give some, if they're not testing anywhere else quant part, they will come to this chapter and they might pick up a calculation of this part, the logic. Okay, call formula is important. European option. I've not heard about they asking you if there is an income and how the formula or how the process is changed, even though the steps are simple, but I've not heard about it being tested. American option, no, I've not heard about it. Warrants, this is important. This has been tested in the past exams. Warrant part. Volatility estimation is okay. Overall, the implied volatility concept should be clear. What is implied volatility? Okay, so that is the idea. Next chapter, which is option Greeks. Lot of people feel pressure in option Greeks because there's so many formulas. They generally, if they want to test, they generally test the formula of only delta. Okay, gamma also they don't test. Okay, so naked and covered position is okay. They don't test generally over here. Delta and delta hedging. Okay, this diagram is important. This paragraph is important. This diagram is important again. The entire option delta part important. Don't skip it. The calculation and the sum important. Forward delta you can skip. This part you can skip. Dynamic aspect of delta hedging very very important. This entire sum and this part the sum is also tested in the exam. Maintaining the hedge, this part is important. Delta neutral portfolio is okay. Delta of the portfolio, this is important. Weighted average, like the way duration was calculated, this can also be calculated. Portfolio delta. Next is theta. Theta, in the theta section, only the understanding calculation part they don't test. These part, these part you should focus more on, marking it as star. Gamma formula also not tested heavily. This entire section, and there's a gamma neutral sum. This part, this sum is also important. They have not tested this sum heavily in the past, but I feel that this can get tested. So important. Relationship between everything is okay. Vega, you should remember this diagram for the Vega. Rho is also okay. Hedging activity in practice is also okay. Portfolio insurance, you can read these two paragraphs. Okay, so with this, we have completed the last chapter of your book 4, which is the option Greeks. And I hope this video will help you in your preparation. I've tried to mark whatever is important from the exam perspective. Okay, what I feel is might come in your exam. So please make sure that these important concepts you don't skip when you're doing the revision. Please make sure that you go through these concepts properly. And I hope this video or this session is helpful for your preparation. So I'm closing the session. If you have any queries, you can put it on the comments section. I'm also posting other videos to make sure that the students who are preparing for the exam, their life becomes easy. Okay, and I think so that will be really helpful in making the community grow and making more and more FRM students clearing the exam possible. Okay, so with this, closing the session. Thank you very much for joining in, guys.